Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Law and Legitimacy. We knew it was going to be dangerous to step away from the airwaves yesterday. God only knows what our elected officials, judges, and prosecutors could do to the Republic while we slept. And we awoke this morning or went to bed last night to one of the more consequential days in American legal history.
You smell that? It smells like jet fuel.
It smells like, yeah, Pat Clifton. I love the smell of jet fuel in the morning. You know, I don't know who Mr. Clifton is. Rumor has it he might be an airline pilot. So that's a venal sort of confession. I love the feel of legal briefs in the morning. I love the look of legal opinions in the morning. I love the look and feel of indictments in the morning. Hey, where's Tom Wolfe when you need him? Do you remember the book Bonfire of the Vanities? Maybe you don't. It was written it was about the 1980s New York. I don't recall the actual year of publication, but it was about the sort of self-righteous, politically correct, glitterati elite. Tom Wolfe gave us such expressions as vampires to refer to women on the Upper East Side who watched every ounce and tried to remain svelte into their 70s and 80s, well beyond the age at which they should have been tap dancing on the libidinal coals of the desires of strangers. Well, I think we need Tom Wolfe today because now what we got going on in Georgia is just extraordinary. I mean, could it be chance that the chief prosecutor in this new 19-defendant indictment against Donald Trump was actually born with the name Fani? Fani Willis flatulated out last night. She had, flatus interruptus.
Flames of the devil who went down to Georgia to do
a
this
19-defendant indictment of Donald Trump under Florida's racketeering statute for a pattern of criminal behavior that stretched from election day into late 2022. And she promises to prosecute all 19 defendants in a single trial. I don't know what 2 years she expects to put that trial on, but I've had a chance to look through the indictment, and it's what you would expect. Every effort to overturn the election results in 2020 is a result of fraud. Misstatements of fact were made. Attempts were made to solicit others in an ongoing conspiracy or criminal enterprise under the RICO statute. Racketeering Influenced and Corrupts Organization Act. I believe 7 states have their own independent RICO statute, and RICO statutes also exist in the federal system. RICO requires proof of various statutorily defined predicate acts. That is, that certain acts prohibited under state law were made by the same group, in this case, the 19, who she says were associated, in fact, with the aim of overturning Georgia's election results. And she nods in the direction and charges actually the fake electors claim. We've talked about this in terms of alternative electors slates in states in which there are contests about electors. But she basically decided that she would steal the stage, and she has charged an extremely ambitious indictment. What's more, she's not negotiated with anybody to turn themselves in. She has apparently sought arrest warrants for each of the 19, and they have until the 25th to contact her to arrange to turn themselves in, or what? She's going to ask for extradition warrants. So, I haven't seen comments from President Trump on this yet. I don't know whether he's going to turn up in Georgia. He hired the billion-dollar lawyer to represent him in the pending Georgia cases last year, thus stealing another page from a Tom Wolfe novel. I mean, the characters in this case are larger than life.
I actually love this. Norm, I'm a big fan of this move. I didn't know that this happened, and this is a Vanity Fair article on the screen from August of last year. So this isn't August 14th, 23, people. This is 1 year ago. I love this move. I really do. I think this is going to play well. And it's because in Georgia, this is one of the more culturally relevant criminal defense figures imaginable, right? Fulton County is the center of love and hip hop, right, as it were. And the hashtag billion dollar lawyer is known for representing the premier A-list celebrity rappers that hail from Atlanta, right?
Well,
Gucci
God bless
among them.
Can't wait to see. I can't wait to see the closing argument. You know, I can't wait to see whether there'll be a case. Now, obviously, a lot of people this morning are talking about the fact that the indictment was leaked prematurely. Apparently, the grand jury was sitting in Georgia until late into the evening, hour or so, perhaps hours before the grand jury even voted. A clerk in the Georgia court in the Fulton County courthouse put online a copy of the charges, maybe of the indictment itself, thus leading people to say, wait a minute, this is proof, of something. It's not really proof of anything in my mind other than incompetence. I mean, it's pretty clear that Fani knew she was going to get the indictment, that it was drafted.
The state known for the pipe burst is having troubles administering prosecution that they've been building for a couple of years. No, color me surprised.
So, but here's one of the things that I find interesting. She has apparently, I've had a chance to scan through the indictment this morning. I haven't read it carefully yet. So there are 19 defendants that are indicted. There are 30 unindicted co-conspirators. There are apparently a number of people who have been granted immunity deals of one sort or another by Georgia to testify. Each of the individuals who has fallen into the net of this broad, sweeping indictment in Georgia now has an absolute right to plead the Fifth Amendment in any court in which they are questioned about these events. Now, if you've been granted immunity, no, you don't have a right to plead the Fifth in the jurisdiction that granted you immunity because that you don't face prosecution. However, all of these individuals in the Georgia case can plead in the Fifth in any prosecution brought by the federal government. So this may be proof that Fani Willis and Jack Smith weren't talking to one another, because to the degree that she has sought criminal charges for RICO against a person associated with Trump, that person's going to tell Jack Smith, I ain't testifying unless I get a federal grant of immunity. And it's very hard to get federal grants of immunity. It's also, Vivek Ramaswamy, has offered, we see on Twitter, to raise to write for and file an amicus brief on Trump's behalf, charging something like prosecutorial misconduct arising from the fact that the indictment was publicized hours before it was voted on by the grand jury. I think Vivek is shooting blanks there. He's got what psychodramatists might call act hunger. Clearly, the Donald Trump show is the most interesting show in the country right now, and Vivek wants a piece of it. But this is not much of an issue. It makes Fani look bad. It makes the Fulton County courthouse look like a collection of half-wits.
Right, and Norm, I think that it's a bigger deal than you would. I know that the bigger issue is within the indictment itself to you, right? And
right. This strikes me as a clerical error.
Right, but is it? I mean, of all the cases for there to be a clerical error attendant to, this is the case within that office. And I think
what's the harm? What's the prejudice? People got a 2-hour jump on the news.
So there's a large feeling that this is a politically motivated prosecution to begin with. And so what Vivek says here strikes and it resonates with voters, with people who have seen this process playing out. And I want us to talk about what Lawyer Will, I put it at the bottom here from the Rumble chat. He asked, how is it going to work if Trump has to be in court at the same time in two of his cases? Before we get to that, though, I just want to say that from my perspective, I think that the leak in and of itself it's emblematic of an entire first-term presidency of Donald Trump. Right? Vivek is on record in the Candace Owens podcast in particular. He says that there was election interference, and not only in 2020, but he says that the 2016 election was interfered with because Trump was barred from governing during his entire first term as president by things that look a lot like this, Norm. Right? So this strange phenomenon attendant to Trump is that everything involving Trump seems to appear in places that it shouldn't prior to it should be public at all, right?
No, I hear you.
So this is part of a larger pattern. So if we take it in isolation, sure, more of an administrative thing. But if we back up and look at the bigger context of this, of course, the fourth indictment against President Trump in the middle of a campaign season, of course, it comes down with 41 counts, 19 total defendants, right? And then also shows the name of all the jurors on it, unredacted,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
When it really is.
that's
And
more
so
significant than anything,
so I think this is a huge blunder, and that's why I sent this tweet to you, because I think that this is, he does, as much as he is in campaign mode, I think that he has his fingers on the pulse of what a lot of people give a damn about. And one thing that Vivek knows is that there is no ground to be gained for him with the voters that he's seeking to convince by detracting from a Trump candidacy. He's very smart that way, in my
Well,
opinion.
I get that.
He hasn't sought to put himself on the outside of Trump. He's actually saying, look at what's going on. My entire platform is built on giving remedy to exactly what you're seeing play out with your president.
Those may well be political considerations. I'm not a politician. I'm a lawyer, and so I mean I'm looking at it from a legal perspective and ROI, return on investment, of the time he spends on it. And I don't think that a motion to dismiss the indictment based on this clerical error is going to get much farther than a judge's wastebasket. Because there's really no prejudice to the defense, insofar as it illustrates the political point that people just can't wait to get a piece of the president's rear end. Yeah, it does illustrate it. But is anybody going to be able to prove that Fani Willis and Jack Smith and the prosecutor up in New York, I'm drawing up Alvin Bragg, have an association in fact, and that this association in fact stitches back to 2020 and earlier to 2016 and is part of a concerted effort on the part of known Trump haters to subvert his efforts to govern? I mean, that's hot. That's political rhetoric that is unprovable in a courtroom and just won't get anywhere. So I hear what you're saying, and I think it illustrates the larger problem of this indictment as we move forward into the 2024 electoral season. Of course, it's going to dominate the news. And of course, it's going to require lengthy, expensive, and time-consuming proceedings. And of course, those proceedings will overlap with proceedings elsewhere and create the sorts of problems that lawyer Will addressed, and we'll talk about those in a minute. And this virtually guarantees that no matter whatever happens to the other cases against Trump, there will be pending active litigation from now until the time of the November 2024 election. And this goes to Will's point. So, I mean, Will asks, what happens if Trump has simultaneous court dates? There'll have to be an order of priority given in the criminal cases. Trump has a right to attend his proceedings. He has a right to be present at every critical stage of the proceedings. That is wherever evidence is heard, when substantive motions are argued, even when procedural motions are argued. He can waive his right to appear at a procedural motion. He can even claim he doesn't want to attend the trial. He'd have to have the court's permission not to attend the trial. But I think what will happen now with respect to potentially conflicting court dates is that he has a right to be present in each one. And, absent the ability to appear simultaneously in two locations, that means they'll have to appear one at a time. I once had a judge tell me, when he was trying to schedule me for trial, he says, Mr. Pattis, the problem with you is you're just too busy. And I said, well, Judge, there's a simple solution. What's that? I said, clone me. Then we'll both be twice as happy. He never had the power to issue such an order, nor will such an order be issued in the Donald Trump case. So this case will be scheduled, given Fannie's wild determination to prosecute all 19 people. I mean, I just can't imagine this case taking less than if this case came in fewer than 6 months of trial time, I'd be stunned. I view this case as likely to consume the better part of a year if it stands. But here's the other question, and it's the more serious question. This case should be challenged on First Amendment grounds. Basically, what she's held
That's right. Yep.
Is that a criminal association, in fact, consisted of those who were determined to challenge the electoral results in 2020. And that happens to be the leadership of the Republican Party as then occupying the White House. If you want to look at an example of criminalizing the opposition, it can't get more bolder. It can't get more bold than Fannie's flatulent move here. And so, I don't know what to expect in this case. I'm sure all of the defendants have lawyered up. It's going to be an administrative nightmare to try to coordinate the defense in that case. The billion-dollar lawyer is going to earn his fee, and I hope he got paid $1 billion. I think, Fani didn't help herself by charging so broadly. And I think she fanned the flames, no pun intended, of a legitimation crisis, because basically what she's held now is the very problem, or what she's done is created the very problem that illustrates a legitimacy crisis. When you view your adversary as criminal, and the one side holds power, it's just, the other side takes it, it's a state of nature in war. What you've done is you've delegitimized political institutions. And so I fear for the 2024 electoral race in ways that I haven't before, because to the degree that Trump continues to run and generate support because people believe that he speaks for them, that he represents a sense of the forgotten American, that he represents an opposition to folks who would manage us for our own welfare, that he represents a sense of outrage at what this country has become and a desire to retain old and traditional values in the face of those who would rework everything in their name of social justice, climate change, the public health state, whatever it is. To the degree that Trump represents the grand rejection of the politics of virtue, he's going to continue to run, and he's going to continue to generate millions of supporters, and he's going to continue to do so while determined prosecutors call him a criminal and try to hold him up in court. And what that's going to do is make the law look like an ass to those
I think that's my not my biggest fear in all this, but one thing I take specific exception to is how unimpressive someone like Fani Willis is, and the discretion and influence and power that she wields in these circumstances. It does make the law a mockery of itself. What's going on. So especially in the context of the leaked documents, and then her inability to communicate or articulate any sensible justification to the media when challenged on it in the presser that she gives. It's just the whole situation, Norm, gives this really demoralizing effect to people who are otherwise unlearned in the practice of law, right? It looks like a political farce on the surface. And for those of us who are able to dive underneath the surface of that and discuss some of the merits of the issues challenged, right? A lot of that stuff a lot of what you care about most, Norm, gets discarded because of the optics. And that's my issue.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, so we've got an interesting sort of difference of perspective between Dawn McNeil and photography. Dawn writes, "No one I know in conservative Wisconsin takes any of these indictments seriously in a legal sense. Moves people to Trump, Republican Party dead if they cower like they did on Russia, Russia, Russia." So that's one perspective. Photography takes a different view. Democracy cannot survive a diversion from belief in established institutions to one person, especially when that one person throws his entire Republican team under the bus. I'm not sure. I think that overstates photography. I'm sort of with Dawn on this one. I think that overstates the significance of Trump as a person. I don't find him appealing in the slightest. I don't like him. I wouldn't want to go to dinner with him. I don't know what would happen if his team called on the phone, and asked for help. I don't know what I would do, but I view Trump as the canary in the mine shaft. I view him not as he's certainly a celebrity personality, but he's an unappealing personality. But what he represents in American politics is the force of rejection, is the power of scorn. And so I don't think people are saying, Donald, 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 we love you. I mean, with what they're saying is, Donald, 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 they're coming at you because they're after us. And at least somebody's standing up and saying no. So we'll find out. What in the world? What are they smoking? Moving to Montana soon? Going to be a dental floss tycoon? Isn't that old Frank Zappa song? So last night or yesterday in Montana, a startling ruling from a trial court judge granting declaratory relief to the so-called youth defendants in what is referred to as a landmark climate decision case.
That's Gen Z. Gen Z just dunked on the whole state of Montana. That's what just happened. A bunch of people from the ages 5 years old to 22 years old just windmill dunked Vince Carter style on the entire state of Montana by some obscure perversion of their state constitution. That's what
Well,
happened.
let's talk about that. Let's unpack what happened. So here's what the ruling does not do. The ruling does not say that Montana has to shut its gasoline stations or that fossil fuels are prohibited in Montana. In Montana, and let's situate this in the broader constitutional scheme of things. We've talked any number of times about federalism. There's a federal government, at least in theory, of limited powers. And then the state governments retain the police power. That is the power to regulate the health, education, and welfare of people within their jurisdiction. And this includes, and in every state, I think does include, a Department of Environmental Protection or environmental regulators. And those regulators must approve siting plans. If you want to open a new energy facility, for example, you have to obtain state approval. Whether you should or not, whether the state of nature and in an ideal world, you need the government's consent to do anything is not the question here. The fact remains that in every state in the United States, there is a Department of Environmental Protection that's entrusted with approval of massive energy projects. In Montana, state regulators passed a law that said state legislators passed a law that said regulators do not have to consider the impact of climate change with respect to the siting of fossil fuel facilities, period. End of discussion. The plaintiffs in this case, a bunch of young people motivated and supported by public interest groups, brought an action saying, wait a minute, we have a right to be heard. We have a right to be heard because fossil fuels hurt our health because of climate change. And so they filed an action under a provision of the Montana Constitution. And, take note of this because this is really what's significant about this case. Every state has a constitution. And much like the federal constitution, every state retains or expresses that certain rights are fundamental. And so in Article 2, Section 3 of the Montana Constitution, there's a section called inalienable rights. And there's a parenthetical clause in that section that talks about having an inalienable right, but the print's too small, Mike. I think to a clean.
I'll blow it up a little bit here, but it says Section 3 says all persons are born free and have certain inalienable rights. They include the right to a clean and healthful environment and the rights of pursuing life's basic necessities and joining.
Stop there. That clause, the right to a clean and healthful environment, is the clause on which the entire Montana case turns. Because the court held that the Constitution gave that as an inalienable right, it basically said that any person in Montana can bring an action asserting that right has been violated. And so what the young folks did what the Gen Zers did in Montana was say that the statute prohibiting the state from considering the environmental impacts of fossil fuel violated their rights under this provision of the state constitution. The result was a bit of legal, I don't want to call it trickery, but it was a sophisticated legal move on their part because it trapped Montana. Montana, according to observers, really just kind of mailed the defense in. They didn't take it seriously. First, they tried to challenge the kids as lacking standing. Then they tried to say these are political questions. And the court agreed in part that they were political questions because initially what the kids sought was a right to have almost like a receiver appointed to oversee the state's environmental regulations to assure that those regulations accommodated their theories of climate change. The court rejected those claims as quote unquote political questions more suitable for the legislature, but permitted the case to advance and then evaluated the statute under something called strict scrutiny. Now, you've heard us talk about standards of review before. When rights are fundamental, many courts in the United States, all federal courts, and certainly many state courts, then talk about how do we review a claim? What's the standard of review? What should we be looking for? And so the question presented for this court was actually a very narrow question. And that question was, did the government offer a compelling interest in its support of this statute? Did they and was the statute narrowly tailored to achieve that interest? The state really made no claim at all. Just as we don't have to consider this at all. And the trial court rejected that reasoning and said that's not compelling. That's no reason at all. And therefore, I'm going to grant this ruling, or I'm going to grant relief because the state failed to justify the basis of the statute. I think that it was bad lawyering in the Montana Attorney General's office, because there should have been a broader fight about political questions and about whether the so-called rational basis standard of review was applicable. Under that statute, under that standard, a statute is upheld if the legislatures can give reasons, good reasons. They don't even have to be good reasons. I guess I misstated that. If they can give reasons for why they've chosen to do what they've done. So I think the case goes up to the Minnesota or Montana Supreme Court. And I don't know whether justices. Do you know, Michael, whether justices are elected in Montana or not?
Just getting interested in this case, so this is something that we'll put on the ledger to track. I've put something else on the screen. This is from I believe the Washington Post article about this case, and just to make sure that we hit this, and I think it's something I brought up to you that struck me when I was reviewing the procedural history of the case, and I'll bring that stuff back up on the screen in just a moment. But as it relates to this section, it says, despite the track record of dismissals for youth-led climate cases in the United States, experts said the Montana youth had an advantage in the state's constitution, which guarantees what we've already put on the screen, a right to a clean and healthful environment. Montana, a major coal producer, is home to the largest recoverable coal reserves in the country. The plaintiffs' attorneys say that the state has never denied a permit for a fossil fuel project. The youths focused on this constitutional right across 5 days of emotional testimony in June, where they made claims about injuries they have suffered as a result of climate change. A 15-year-old with asthma described himself as, quote, a prisoner in my own home, end quote, when isolating with COVID during a period of intense wildfire smoke. Ricky Held, the 22-year-old plaintiff for whom the lawsuit is named, detailed how extreme weather has hurt her family's ranch. Held testified that a favorable judgment would make her more hopeful for the future. Quote, I know that climate change is a global issue. She knows this, but Montana has to take responsibility for our part in that, she said. So I want to focus there that where the article says Held testified that a favorable judgment would make her more hopeful for the future. And the fact, Norm, that this case has everything to do with mental health, although the court does not agree, right? So in the procedural rundown in this order, I have here on the screen where it says that the defendants in the case moved for an independent medical examination, or in the alternative, a motion to strike the opinions and testimony of the plaintiff's expert, Dr. Lisa Van Susteren, pursuant to procedural rule 35A, alleging that plaintiffs' allegations of mental health impacts as a result of climate change had placed their mental health at issue. These are plaintiffs between the ages of 5 and 22. And this is all based on this speculative theory that they're entitled by state constitution to a clean and healthful environment. And we have a Washington Post article claiming that the lead plaintiff says that the remedy for this would make her more hopeful for the future, except we're not allowed to examine the mental health of someone, of any of the plaintiffs, not the least of which one who was talking about being confined during COVID as part and parcel to the testimony about the wildfire smoke and asthma. And so here, correlation with climate change. This stuff is ridiculous. And this is why I said that Montana got dunked on by Gen Z. They got dunked on. They didn't take Gen Z's mental health issues seriously.
Well, I can't agree more. It raises the following thought experiment, and I think I don't think that this decision is a great national precedent. I'll be very curious to see what the Montana Supreme Court does with it. But here's a thought experiment, Mike. Greta Thunberg walks into a singles bar and sees at the bar David Hogue having a drink. The two get together, they marry. Can you imagine their spawn? I mean, oh my God, I'm worried about everything. I need you to stop. I need you to stop living the way you do. I need you to stop doing what you do. My feelings are so important. As Dawn says, or as Maury says from California. By the way, we appreciate the dedication. It's got to be like 5:30 in the morning out there. Your feelings aren't protected by the Constitution, are they? I mean, they're not. And I don't want to minimize the seriousness because of the debate about the Anthropocene era and whether human activity is destroying our environment. I think it's a serious scientific debate. I would much, Mike, rather hear from Vivek Ramaswamy on the Montana case than I would on the Trump indictment.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
For $1 a dozen. Vivek has gone on record saying that he thinks climate change is a religion, the religion of climate change, and he's critical of it and says that fossil fuels are necessary for human civilization and development. Vivek, this is where you should be putting your energies and your focus, because, Donald Trump is 77. He's not going to live forever. One of these days, one of those cheeseburgers is going to go right to his arteries, and he's going to check out, and we're going to be left glaring at one another with the same legitimation crisis he represents. The climate debate is not going to go away anytime soon. And the litigation efforts are apparently underway in all 50 states to do what is done in Montana. And that is to place the issue of climate change on the agenda for environmental regulators. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's not. But I would much rather hear from Vivek on this issue. And if any of you see him out there discussing it, let us know about it. We may miss it.
Yeah, someone clip this and invite him to even talk about it. We don't even need him to come on to Law and Legitimacy to discuss it. He just, I think that this decision is something that he could use to hold up the mantle of dismantling ESG and DEI. I mean, how are we supposed, and it's crazy to me that we have lawyers out there that are willing to take cases on behalf of this plaintiff's class. Someone asked in the Rumble chat earlier, and I can't remember who it is, I would have to scroll back up, but who was behind the funding for this lawsuit to begin with, which is a great question. I
noticed in the press coverage that apparently at Columbia, there is a law and climate change clinic. And so, the infrastructure. So let's talk about the Scopes trial in the 1920s. That's the famous trial that Clarence Darrow lost. John Scopes violated the law in Tennessee by teaching evolution.
Summer for the Gods is the book. It's an amazing book for anybody who wants to read a recount of the Scopes trial. Summer for the Gods.
And so what happened in that case is, Tennessee had a law that said you had to teach creationism. You couldn't teach evolution. A lot of people opposed that law, including the American Civil Liberties Union. And so they searched for a plaintiff that would allow them to test the law, and they settled on John Scopes. And John Scopes became the defendant. They searched for a test case, and they looked for somebody who'd be sympathetic, who'd be articulate, who had no downside, and who represented the interests of those who funded the interest groups. And so I'd say the same thing happens with these kids and with plaintiffs. When there are interest groups, when you go to law school, and we haven't talked a lot about our efforts to cultivate new young lawyers. But when you go to law school, what you learn to do is you learn to represent individuals with interest. And we've talked about that before. Interest groups represent individuals who share their interests. And they are sort of a perversion of the legal process, because what they do is they look for people who reflect their values. And then they represent the person because that person reflects their values. They don't represent the person because the person is in conflict with others and has interests of his own. And so following the money in this litigation is significant.
Out of the context of environment. Sorry, Norm, but and look at the modern state of the ACLU or the Southern Poverty Law Center as examples of that perversion, right? Several decades after the most important work that those organizations ever did, they are unrecognizable for the origins or the essence of why those interest groups were formed to begin with.
And this is why Trump is not going to go away, because for those of us who feel that somehow the country took a turn not for the better, and has now become unrecognizable as it's governed by elites and institutions with interests of their own that don't reflect the interests of ordinary Americans. Ordinary Americans are pissed off. They're going to fight back. I was at a barbecue up here in northern Vermont. We're not far from the Canadian border up in the Northeast Kingdom the other night, and I was chuckling as I listened to what everybody was talking about. They weren't talking about Trump. They weren't talking about the environment. They weren't talking about DEI. They weren't talking about ESG. There was a passionate discussion about whether the game warden was a little too aggressive in how he was policing the various wildlife laws in the state. This is because this is where these folks live. This is
Right.
how they express themselves, how they interact with the world, and this is their contact with government. This is what they're pissed off about, was a government overreaching. And my intuition is that there are tens, if not hundreds of millions, well, not hundreds of millions, but tens of millions of Americans in the country who feel the same way. They feel they've become a stranger in their own home and they want to take it back. And that's what Trump represents. Now, he's not a team builder. What happens after Trump? Don't know. I mean, we're going to find out.
I think that, Trump not being a team builder is a little bit of it's a bit of a harsh criticism from my view, but I do want your opinion on this, Norm, and I'll offer mine before you give yours, just so I put my cards on the table. Critical Thought in the Rumble chat says, Democrats scoff at the simplicity, blind faith, and, quote, unlearnedness of the right wing, forgetting that those are powerful forces when wielded toward a common goal. And I said to her, it's sort of the same as in the early aughts, in the early 2000s, when it was a more conservative regime. And the modern view of the unlearnedness of the political right, the corollary to that when I was growing up was the unlearnedness or the feebleness, perhaps the feebleness physically, the feebleness emotionally of the political left, of the hippie class, right? That was the anti-war, anti-establishment. It got more of an egalitarian mindset, and it's interesting to me that the media can be so harsh to the political right, because when the media was granted its power by and through advocating for essentially the same profile or the same archetype of the individual being pushed down by a very top-heavy governing force.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think political culture has changed. I mean, I don't know who was it the other day that wrote that the left has now become what it used to ridicule. It's become authoritarian, and I think what drives American history is individuals' request or quest rather, in pursuit of a sense of significance in their own home, in their own community, and a sense of efficacy. My sense is that as digitopia descends upon us and AI makes more of our decisions and we're governed more and more by impersonal decisions that are a result of big data, our quest for significance now gets transformed into bizarre assertions of identity. And, it may be that we've got people, trans activists dancing for children in libraries because they can't find any other way to express themselves. Maybe if they had a rifle and they were out hunting for deer in northern Vermont, they might have a sense of engagement with the world around them. But people want to be heard. They want to feel that they have efficacy. And if they can't have efficacy in what they produce for themselves, they will try to produce an image of themselves for others and try to find it there. And so we end up with a culture that's entirely artificial. And we end up with a culture that, for people who still have a sense of their relationship to themselves and their community and what's real, becomes ridiculous, becomes an object of scorn.
Well, and then here's another from Mari, who's on the West Coast, Northern California. So it's 5:38 Mari time. So thank you recognizing that dedication. Love that. But Mari says, I think Trump isn't a team builder too. And again, I still think that it's a harsh criticism for somebody who all you have to do is look at what's going on right now, the simultaneous prosecutions of this man in 4 different districts, and understand that these are real people that have to hold these positions. So it's, on one hand, it's, he's not a team builder, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's plenty of reason to think that, that he fundraised, and there's criticism to be had of fundraising off of January 6th and asking where that money went. Where was the support for those prosecuted on January 6th? And I think, Norm, you've been very outspoken about that point in particular, but I also think that is to ignore the difficulty of expecting that when people are appointed, that they are going to do the job that they are appointed to do in an environment that is harshly critical or impedes that effort by its very nature, right? Like I said earlier in this stream, the 2016 election was won, but Trump's entire first term as president was his path to governing was impeded at every available step. So it is I think that any criticism of him in terms of being lacking as a team builder must acknowledge that environment in order to withstand scrutiny. And not to say that there isn't criticism to be had. I just think that saying out of pocket, he's not a team builder, when the MAGA movement as we know it, when the modern political right has been forged by and through Trump's ascension to the highest political office, right? That is, our criticism of his presidency is fine, but our acknowledgement of the revitalization of the essence of federalism, state sovereignty, individual sovereignty. We're talking about local politics in here. Norm, you just made a reference to the conversation that you were overhearing over the weekend and what people really care about. All of that has been ignited by the Make America Great Again movement, right? And so perhaps Trump isn't a team builder close to him, based on the facts and circumstances I just said, but people are building their own teams because of Trump, in my view.
And maybe the message is we just don't want to be governed. We've somehow lost sight of classic questions that used to dominate the political discussion in this country. What is the role of government in our lives? Is it to assure us that we are safe and secure and that we feel good, such that as the Gen Z kid, the Gen Z kids in Montana persuaded a trial court, or is government's role to make it possible for us to accomplish for ourselves what we can by our own talents and skill? Individual versus the state, the collective versus the individual. These used to be the dominant themes of American politics. We've been seduced into thinking it's now identity and fulfillment of the least among us, and that recognition of everyone's right to feel good. I think most of us, or at least most of us on this listening and coming to this podcast regularly, reject that as something of a creepy feel. And I think that explains Trump's enduring popularity, notwithstanding all of his legal difficulties. And we'll see.
One thing before we go here, we've got a tip from Critical Thought over on Rumble, and she asks, will you guys go to about 50 minutes and just play for a minute? It's Greta Thunberg admitting science wasn't a part of her equation, that they had drag clubs, but it was inherently unsatisfying because it was based on performance/tips. They wanted legitimacy cheaply. The natural solution is to make the children's section of the library into a drag club, said no one ever except trannies. So I'm going to play this. Just thank you for the tip, and Norm will play it for just a minute so we can hear what Critical Thought wanted to hear out of this video.
To move on to the next project, to be able to reinvest
for standard tax
and grow business.
Are you fine to be subject to the same thing that the tech companies in my district or Wall Street is? Can you just say you're fine with standard tax accounting principles?
I think to take, Mr. Chairman, to take one provision of the tax code and say it should be applied in the same form and fashion to every business without looking at the entire tax code. The purpose of the tax code is to provide revenues to meet government expenditures.
You said you were saying. To be able to provide. Last question, sir. You said that you're being treated the exact same as every other industry. That's what you said under oath. That's what you said to the press. And I'm saying right now there's one provision of the code. We can discuss the others where you're not. Where every other person gets 7 years. You didn't know the 7 years. That's standard accounting 101. Trust me, that's true. Now, you could deny the net present value of money. That would be like denying.
Are we listening to the right thing?
Obviously, so. There's a benefit if you get to depreciate it all at once. Can you just, on a consensus, say you commit to what you said? You're fine being treated like every other industry with a 7-year deduction.
We're certain.
So I think the context here is perhaps the discrepancy in testimony over someone advocating for more of the ESG related stuff rather than how the fossil fuel industry is created. And this looks to be a House Oversight Reform and Subcommittee from April of a couple of years ago. So Critical Thought, if you can give a little more context to this, or if we've got the wrong link, let us know. But wanted to just say thank you for the tip and give you that spotlight for a moment. Mari says, I don't want to be governed, I want to be left alone, and I want to leave folks to pursue their own lives.
I'm loving that, Maury. I couldn't have said it better.
Absolutely. Well, the one thing we didn't get to was what I wanted to talk about with respect to Vivek again. But ultimately, I think that it's...
We'll get to it tomorrow?
Yeah, maybe. But here's the thing. Vivek is a wildly impressive figure. Very intelligent. And because of my sports background, I think I'd said to you this, Norm. he appeared on Candace Owens' podcast with no idea what the questions were that were going to be asked from the likes of DC Drano, who I recognize on this podcast as being one of those inorganic sort of figures that began pushing against Vivek and taking things out of context without any sort of diligence. And DC Drano was the one, asking the questions. And the way it looked to me was like a high school gym teacher trying to guard a young Allen Iverson, right? And then trying to go to the sideline. I wanted to force him to go left after he just gets crossed up, trying to figure out, how to dissuade people from thinking that he got bested. But it is time to do some real diligence on Vivek. But what's happening online right now is not real diligence, right? The guy is able to go one-on-one with anyone. So if there are legitimate criticisms out there from our viewers and listeners, because I get texts from people that are saying, hey, watch out for Vivek, or, stay skeptical, these things. I get it from a number of different sources. Norm, I'm open to that. Right. So maybe perhaps we begin filtering. And I know that there's one viewer in particular that really wants us to talk about Article 2 eligibility. Maybe that becomes relevant at a certain point, but from the perspective of what needs to evolve within the context of Article 2 eligibility for that stuff to not be a real concern. And I know Kamala Harris's name has come up within that as well. I don't mean to stoke things that are going to take us off track, but if we're going to do, because I see that a life after Trump includes politicians like Vivek. Maybe it's not Vivek in particular. So I'll state that very clearly for everybody watching. Someone who is as quick on his feet, who is as young and ambitious as Vivek is the future of politics in America. Someone that can survive in the digital age and thrive, doesn't have to hide from the cameras, can be ambushed by someone from a political opposition trying to do a gotcha, whatever. He is a creature of the new era of politics. Whether you want that to be the case or not, this is where we are. So he deserves to be scrutinized, but he also deserves to be recognized for the fact that his ideas are better than any other ideas I see on the political spectrum. And I do see a crazy alignment coming between him and RFK Jr. Maybe we can explore that later, but RFK Jr. just appeared on Tucker's latest episode, and that's a really impressive episode, if I do say so myself. They align on certain of things, but in particular, disbanding or dismantling of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So anyway, nothing.
No. I mean, just good points all.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for being here as always. Let's see. We went over a little bit, but you can find us here tomorrow, 8 a.m. Eastern time. I'm going to check Rumble real quick. Let's see. Okay. So Critical Thought says around the 30 or 40 minute mark. All right. I'll go and listen to that. Vivek on Pacman's pod handles him. And then In the Cloud says she would vote for you, Norm.
He said young.
Well, and Pete Atkinson says, I want Norm as supreme ruler and emperor. I like that better. That has a nice ring to it, right? Anyway, you can find us on Rumble Video, YouTube Live, and X every morning. We went long today, but I think that's just because that's the nature of the beast. Yesterday was an insane day. Please make sure you've hit the thumbs up. Please make sure you're subscribed. And if you don't find us here live, you can always find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Audible, Overcast, etc. And if you're there, leave us 5 stars or leave us alone. Norm, I will see you tomorrow.
You will.